Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our philosophy class. This is chapter 2 of our logic book called Evaluating Arguments. As always, please be sure to read the assigned material before jumping into these lectures so that hopefully the material will be a little bit easier to grasp. So here in this lecture, we want to talk a bit about inference and implication, and then go into more specifics about the different argument types. So we'll start with the deductive arguments, and then inductive arguments, and then we'll finish up by talking about abductive arguments, which are often just referred to as inferences to the best explanation. So these arguments are critical in not just philosophy, but also the kinds of reasoning that we see in everyday life, as well as science, math, and hopefully some other scenes that we're familiar with already. Okay, so just to review from a previous lecture, what is an argument? Hopefully we remember how crucial arguments are, what arguments are composed of, and the difference between premise or premises and conclusions. So an argument is supposed to give us reason or reasons for thinking that something is the case. Recall that the conclusion is the statement or proposition that is being supported, and the conclusion is supported by the premise or premises, which are statements doing the supporting or the reasons that we should think that the conclusion is true. And then inference is the reasoning that we go from the premise or premises to the conclusion. That's called inferring something, right? It's the way that we go from the premise or premises to the conclusion is by an inference. And so an argument can have obviously more than one premise, as we've already seen, but only one conclusion. Okay, so as we saw last time, we formalized arguments or presented them in standard form. We also called this explicating an argument or presenting an argument. And recall that that's just listing each premise on a line by itself, and then the conclusion at the bottom, sometimes with a line, sometimes not. It really doesn't matter. But nonetheless, we clearly identify what is intended to be a premise and what is the conclusion. And that, as we've already mentioned, makes argument analysis quite a bit easier, and it makes the reasons and overall reasoning processes a little bit easier to, as I say, to analyze and understand. So the first kind of argument that we want to talk about is deductive arguments. And deductive arguments or deductive reasoning is something that you're already familiar with, even if you didn't call it deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning and arguments are the kind of arguments where we intend to give logically conclusive support to the conclusions, so that if the premises are true, the conclusion absolutely must be true. So I think the most common example of deductive reasoning that we're all familiar with is in math. Arithmetic, we often it's always deductive reasoning in arithmetic. Not all math is deductive, but for the most part, whenever we know, let's say, one of the angles of a triangle, and if we know a second angle of the triangle, well, we can derive or deduce the third angle, right? Because by definition, the sum total of the angles has to be 180 degrees. And if we know two of those angles, then we deduce or derive the third angle. So the same thing goes with deductive arguments. The idea is to give logically conclusive support to the conclusions so that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Or to phrase it differently, the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. So here's a simple example. All cats are mammals. Sophie is a cat. Conclusion, therefore, Sophie is a mammal. So the idea here is that assuming this is true, and assuming this is true, this necessarily follows. If it's true that all cats are mammals, and if we stipulate that Sophie is a cat, it follows necessarily that Sophie is a mammal. So deductive arguments that have the right structure are said to be valid. Now, validity is a very complex term in logic. What we mean by validity has nothing to do with truth, but structure or form. So some arguments have good forms and some arguments don't. So the deductive arguments that do have the right kind of form, those are the ones that are valid. A deductive argument that does not have the proper logical structure is said to be invalid. So the validity or lack thereof of deductive arguments is a separate issue from the truth of the premises. We really want to emphasize that. Validity is a structural matter depending on how an argument is put together, whereas truth concerns the nature of the claims made in the premises and conclusion. So what does this mean? Well, it means that an argument can have the right structure, but obviously the claims, the premises and conclusion could be false. So validity has just to do with the structure or form. If we're talking about whether or not they're true, that's a separate conversation. This is where soundness comes in. So a deductive argument is sound if and only if it is the case that it is valid, so it has the right structure or form, and all of the premises are true. So an argument can have the right structure, but as we mentioned, have one or more false premises. So here's a really good example. Premise 1, all men have 5 arms. Premise 2, Anthony is a man. Conclusion, therefore Anthony has 5 arms. Now the first question is, does this have the right structure? Because this seems very similar to the example that we just saw with Sophie the cat. This does have the right structure. Assuming that all men have 5 arms and Anthony is a man, it follows necessarily that Anthony has 5 arms. Now, is it true? Is premise 1 true? Of course not. I can assure you I don't have 5 arms, but the structure of this argument is good. So that's why we call it valid. But is it sound? Well, in order for a deductive argument to be sound, it must be valid, so it must have the right structure, and all of the premises have to be true. So clearly in this argument, premise 1 is false. Therefore, this argument is valid but unsound. So here are the most commonly used deductively valid argument forms that we'll become familiar with. Maybe some of you have seen these in other classes. The first one is called modus ponens. We use the Latin phrases for these arguments because they're so famous. In these arguments, we use conditional statements, which are quite common. And conditional statements just mean if then, which we use all the time. So here's an example of modus ponens. It has exactly 2 premises and a conclusion. So premise 1 is if A, then B. So let's plug something in there. If it is raining, then I need an umbrella. So notice that it has this form here. Premise 2, it is raining. So A is true. And then the conclusion, therefore B. Therefore, I need an umbrella. So notice that this is if A, then B. Premise 2 is A is true, or the antecedent is true. So in any conditional statement, there are 2 parts. This A part is called the antecedent, and this B part is called the consequent. So hopefully this makes some intuitive sense because we often phrase things even in everyday context where if something occurs, then a consequent or consequence will follow, right? So in this argument form, modus ponens, it always has this form and it's always valid. So at least we know that it has the right structure or form. It's impossible for the premises to be true and lead us to a false conclusion structurally, right? So this is always valid. Modus tollens, or sometimes referred to as denying the consequent, has a slightly different form. So the first premise is the same as modus ponens. Premise 1 is if A, then B. So if it is raining, then I need an umbrella. Premise 2 says not B, or not the consequent. I do not need an umbrella. And then the conclusion is therefore not A. Therefore, it's not raining. So notice this is if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. And this argument pattern or form is also always valid. Here's probably the most common deductive argument form or pattern, and it's the disjunctive syllogism. We use this all the time in everyday contexts where we present a choice a disjunctive statement, either this or that, not this choice, so we're left with the other choice. So either we can take I-5 or Highway 99 to get to Seattle. We can't take I-5 because it is closed. Therefore, we'll have to take Highway 99. Or think of simple things like breakfast. Either we can have coffee or tea for breakfast. Oh, we can't have tea because I'm out. Therefore, we'll have to have coffee. This is called a disjunctive syllogism. Hypothetical syllogism is often referred to as chain reasoning. This is the kind of reasoning where we give a series of conditionals, right? One thing leads to another. So it has this form. If Anthony drinks lead, then he will be sick. If Anthony gets really sick, then he'll go to the hospital. Therefore, if Anthony drinks lead, then he'll go to the hospital, right? Obviously, don't drink lead, but it has this form. Notice, if A, then B, and then if B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. This should say if A, then C. Sorry, I'll fix that. So this is also always valid. But we need to be aware of invalid arguments because obviously not all arguments are valid. They can have a structure very similar to valid argument forms. However, their conclusions do not necessarily follow from their premises. So there's my cat, Sophie. That's a real photo. She loves to lay on vegetables, bags of vegetables. I'm not sure why, but we'll use her for an example here. So let's say we have this argument. All Jedi love vegetables. Sophie loves vegetables. Therefore, Sophie is a Jedi, which would give us the form all A's are B's. This thing is a B, therefore it must be an A. Well, something's wrong with this argument form, right? The conclusion does not follow from the premises. That is, it is possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Something can be a B without being an A. So notice that premise one just said all A's are B's. This thing is a B. It doesn't mean that it's an A, right? So there's something wrong with the structure or form, no matter what I plug in for A and B there. Therefore, this argument form, this reasoning pattern is invalid. It doesn't guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. So here are some other common deductively invalid argument forms and some examples. So denying the antecedent. If A, then B, not A, therefore not B. So here's a good example. If Anthony is a father, then he is a man. Premise two, Anthony is not a father, therefore Anthony is not a man. So why is that defective? Well, there are many men who aren't fathers, right? Just because I'm not a father doesn't mean I'm not a man. So there's something suspect with that reasoning there, and this example shows it. Or affirming the consequent. If Anthony is a father, then he is a man. Anthony is a man, therefore Anthony is a father. Well, that's also not good reasoning because someone can be a man and again, not be a father. So this is invalid reasoning. So whenever we see reasoning like this, we know that it's invalid, and we could even give some technical details and logic to show that this is the case. But hopefully these examples illustrate why this reasoning form is defective or invalid. Okay, so I put some practice on here for you. I would encourage you to pause the video and see if you can get these. I'm not sure if I put the answers on here, but it's good practice. I usually do this in face-to-face classes. So for each of the following arguments, we want to determine whether it is valid or invalid and indicate the argument pattern by name based on what we just saw. So I can actually, if you want to pause it here and do it yourself, I would recommend doing that. And I will actually, I don't think I have a slide for the answers, but I can give the answers momentarily. So for number one, if the Pilgrims built the wall, there would be archaeological evidence of that, but there is no such evidence. So the Pilgrims did not build that wall. So that is modus tollens, and that is valid, right? Because it's denying the consequent. Argument two, if it is raining, then I'll stay inside and play video games. I'll stay inside and play video games. It follows that it must be raining. That argument is invalid, and that is affirming the consequent. Number three, either Yoda or Anthony is a Jedi Master. Yoda is not a Jedi Master, ergo Anthony is a Jedi Master. So that argument is valid, and that is a disjunctive syllogism. Now, is it a sound argument? No, right? Because premise 2 is false. Yoda is a Jedi Master, but it's still a valid argument. That is a disjunctive syllogism. Number 4, if you volunteer at a food kitchen, then you're morally praiseworthy. You do not volunteer at a food kitchen, hence you must not be morally praiseworthy. This is denying the antecedent. This is invalid reasoning, right? You can still be a morally praiseworthy person if you don't volunteer at a food kitchen, right? And so this example really illustrates invalid deductive argumentation. Number 5, if higher education is valuable, then higher education can change lives. If higher education can change lives, then it deserves to be funded. We can conclude that if higher education is valuable, then higher education deserves to be funded. That is valid. That is a hypothetical syllogism, and I would argue a sound argument. And number 6, if ESP, extrasensory perception, were real, psychic predictions would be completely reliable. ESP is real, therefore psychic predictions are completely reliable. That is a valid argument. That is modus ponens. We could talk about whether or not, though, premise 2 is true. But for the moment, the form or structure of the argument is good. So that's valid modus ponens. So just to review, deductive arguments try to prove or demonstrate the truth of the conclusion. It's valid just in case the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And we say they're truth preserving in that their logical structure guarantees the truth of the conclusion, assuming the premise or premises are true. Doesn't mean they actually have to be true. Just if they are true, does it lead to the conclusion? So the arguments we want are sound. Those are deductively valid arguments. They have the right form and structure, and all the premises are true. So those are obviously the arguments that philosophers, scientists, lawyers really prize. Okay, so this leads us to a big part of our course, something that we'll use for an assignment, and that's called P'ing an argument. Don't worry, it's an acronym. P just stands for present, explain, and evaluate, which is something very similar to what we saw in the book for the explicating argument. It just has 3 parts. And this process, this general process, lies at the heart of what philosophers do, and it's a 3-step process. So step 1 is to present or explicate, which we've already seen. So for a deductive argument, to explicate it is just write it down in deductively standard line-by-line format. So the form should be modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism, or hypothetical syllogism. So here's an example. So if I had an argument and I was presenting it or explicating it, it would look something like this. I'd put P1, P2, C. So premise 1, if subjective relativism is true, then no one can ever be epistemically mistaken, but people are epistemically mistaken, therefore subjective relativism is not true. So you don't have to know all the terms there, but that argument is in modus tollens, and it is valid. The second step is to explain the argument. So explaining an argument is the most significant and often difficult part of this process. So to explain an argument, you need to do 2 things for each premise of the argument. The first step is to define any terms in the premise or argument that need defining, and 2, give a rationale for why somebody should think that premise is true. So if we go back to the example, I'm guessing that for at least some of you, some of these words don't make sense. So if I were to give this argument to you or try to convince you that this is a good argument, I would need to tell you what I mean by subjective relativism and epistemically mistaken. So I should define those words, right? That's going to be the first step. We want to make sure that we're understanding what language is in use. And then I want to tell you, or I should tell you, why you should think that premise is true. In other words, I'm giving a little mini argument for why each premise should be accepted by the reader or audience. So again, to do part 1, we give the definition or otherwise explain the meaning of any technical term or semi-technical term that appears in the premise. Technical or semi-technical terms are special words or phrases that we have defined either in the reading or in class to which we have otherwise called attention. Sometimes defining a technical term requires using perhaps another technical term. If this happens, you would need to define that as well, but we do our best to define even seemingly technical terms in non-technical language. So if I were to go back to this example, I would want to define subjective relativism in a way that somebody who's not familiar with philosophy or ethics so that they can understand it, right? Something like subjective relativism is the view that any one person decides what's true or not. Truth is completely subjective relative to each person, right? That gets better, that gives us a better understanding or definition of how we're using that word or phrase. Okay, and then step 2, explain. So to do part 2, we give the reason the premise is supposed to be true. You are in effect giving an informal little argument for that premise. Even if you happen to think that the premise is false, you still need to be able to give the reason that a proponent of the argument would give for thinking that the premise is true. We don't need to do anything for the conclusion when we explain an argument. The premises which you have already presented and explained entail the conclusion. Assuming that the argument's valid, the conclusion should follow necessarily. So we only need to give an explanation or rationale for each premise, why somebody should think that it's true. And then the last part of the process, and especially important for philosophy and law and science, is to evaluate it. To evaluate an argument is to say what you think of it. In particular, we want to say whether we think the argument is sound. If we don't think that an argument, a deductive argument, is sound, then we have to do 2 things. We have to show either that the argument is invalid, that it doesn't have the right form or structure, or that one or more of the premises is false, and then say why we think it's false, right? So it's not enough to just say we don't like arguments or that argument turns me off, right? Things like that. That's not a good philosophical response. A philosophical response is to say either that there's something structurally wrong with the argument, or there is at least one false premise, right? Sometimes for arguments, there's a right answer to the evaluate step. Some arguments just objectively are invalid. Not some, I mean, there are objectively invalid arguments. We just saw some examples. So in other cases, there's going to be disagreement, right? That's the nature of philosophy and argumentation in general. But that's a different conversation than whether or not the argument is structurally good or bad, right? So in some cases, we'll obviously have disagreements about whether or not a premise is true. So that's okay. So inductive arguments, we won't spend a lot of time on, but we just want to separate the language of deductive arguments from inductive arguments. So inductive arguments are the more common arguments that we use on a daily basis. These are the arguments that give probable, or at least intend to give probable support to their conclusions. They can establish only that if their premises are true, their conclusions are probably true. So here's a good example. Premise 1, 85% of the students at this university are right-handed. Sophie is a student at this university. Therefore, Sophie is probably right-handed. So notice the difference between this kind of argument and a deductive argument. In this case, it's only probably true that Sophie is right-handed. I mean, given that 85% of the students are right-handed, it's very likely that she's right-handed, but it's possible that she's part of the 15% who are left-handed, or 10%, or whatever it is, right? So this argument doesn't preserve the truth the way that deductive reasoning and argumentation does, but it can only make it more probable. So inductive arguments that succeed in lending probable support to their conclusions are said to be strong. We don't call them valid or invalid. We call them strong or weak. So strong arguments are such that if the premises are true, their conclusions are probably true. They don't actually have to be true, just that assuming that they are true, does it lead to a probably true conclusion? And inductive arguments that don't do that, that don't provide probable support, are said to be weak. So we can even think of an example before moving on of what a weak argument would be, right? So it'd be something like, I have only eaten 2 apples in my life and they've both been disgusting. Therefore, all apples are disgusting, right? That's not a strong argument. That's a very weak argument because it's a very limited sample size. And I'm inferring to all apples from just 2 apples that I've eaten, right? Not a strong argument. So plenty of examples of weak arguments that are out there, and they're different than deductive argumentation. The other thing we want to mention too is, I might have forgotten it, but an inductive argument that's strong and has all true premises, we don't call that sound, we call that cogent. So I think that's mentioned in the chapter as well. Okay, and then lastly, we'll just mention abductive reasoning or argumentation. This is often just called the inference to the best explanation. So if you've seen Sherlock Holmes, any of the movies or TV shows, or read the books, or for those of you going into law or criminal justice or even business, this is a very common form of reasoning. If you've ever gone out to your car and it hasn't started or something's broken, you've used inductive inference to the best explanation reasoning. So IBE for short is a form of reasoning in which we reason from premises about a state of affairs to an explanation for that state of affairs. So here's a simple example. Anthony failed his philosophy course. The best explanation for his failure is that he didn't read the material or do well on the exams. Therefore, he probably didn't read the material, right? So we can even think of another example. Anthony woke up and went to the freezer. Premise 2, there are glass, shards of glass all over the freezer floor. Therefore, Anthony probably left a bottle of sparkling cider in the freezer overnight, right? Maybe you, like me, have done that before, right? The best explanation is that we've left a bottle in there. Is there another explanation? Sure. Somebody could have smashed a bottle in our freezer. Highly unlikely, right? But nonetheless, what reasoning we're using is inference to the best explanation. We're inferring from the evidence, like a detective at a crime scene or a lawyer or somebody like that, or even a car mechanic, trying to figure out what's the best explanation for the state of affairs. So we use this kind of reasoning all the time. And it's, I think, certainly fair to say that inference to the best explanation is probably the most common piece of inductive reasoning that we have. So just to review, inductive arguments try to make the conclusion more probable or likely. They're strong if the premises are true, then the conclusion is probably true. They're not truth preserving in the same way that deductive arguments are. Their logical structure does not guarantee that the conclusion is true, even if the premises are true, but we can, again, make them likely. And inductive arguments are cogent when they are strong and have all true premises, okay? So here's a nice summary for everything that I've kind of just rushed through. If we have an argument, then we've already said that there are two kinds, deductive and inductive. Is it successful? Is it good reasoning? Well, if it's deductive reasoning, then it's either valid or invalid. Does it have true premises? If the answer is yes, then we have a sound argument. These are the ones we want, right? That are deductive, whether in math or philosophy or elsewhere. If they don't have all true premises, then they're unsound. All invalid arguments are unsound, right? By definition. If an argument is inductive, then we ask, is it successful? Well, if it's weak, then it's not successful. It doesn't give us good reasons for thinking that the conclusion is true if the premises are true. It's strong if it does give us probable reasons for thinking the conclusion is true, given the premises. Does it have all true premises? If the answer is no, then it's uncogent. If the answer is yes, then it's cogent. So I know that these are a lot of terms, but they're important ones, and it lets us, from logic and critical thinking, separate different kinds of reasoning from each other and use the appropriate words when referring to different kinds of reasoning and argumentation. So if you have any questions at all about this material, please be sure to reach out to me. I know there's a lot packed in here, but I'm trying to move quickly. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.